Good morning, all. And today's video is one I've been working on for quite some time, but it's probably one of the most important videos on being autistic that anyone could talk about. And this video is on the more than 40 ways autistic language is a different language than that spoken, written, and used by neurotypical people. And I want to start with, I think this is probably a statement that almost every actually autistic person has either said or thought. And this comes from stylus.co.uk here. I felt I was an alien who had crash landed on another planet, desperately wondering why I couldn't just fit in, why what made sense to others didn't to me, but I would add, and why what makes sense to me didn't to others. Now, the autism spectrum disorder diagnostic criteria is characterized by difficulties with social communication and functioning and ritualistic repetitive behaviors, APA 2013. Communication problems have been at the core of autistic people since at least Bailey in 1996. And so being autistic is considered a neurodevelopmental variant currently defined by the association atypical overt sociocommunicative behaviors, intense interests, repetitive movements, and sensory manifestations, and communication is a core feature of being autistic. Now, why does this matter? Well, because there are two different languages going on. The autistic language and the neurotypical language, and they are different languages. Oh no! Only the neurotypical language is used in federal agencies, state agencies, and state and federal courts, and it's the one way and the only way, or the highway. But it doesn't fit the reality. And so often, just to show why they need to have mandatory specific autism educational training, there are many videos on YouTube done by actually autistic people on the subject of being told by neurotypicals who don't have any kind of autistic training that you don't look autistic. If an autistic person gives their autism diagnosis to a neurotypical or tells a neurotypical person about it, that autistic person in many cases is met with the "you don't look autistic," dismissive neurotypical statement that tries to invalidate the truth of what the autistic person has just said. And so when we hear this neurotypical put down, "you don't look autistic," the correct response is, you don't have an autism education. These neurotypical people and agency and court officials like to act like and tell autistic people that they have to be indistinguishable from a neurotypical. And if they don't win their claims or their cases, and they don't get heard. And if they try to make a claim or go into a court or something like that, they always lose. Well, there's a physical difference in the autistic brain and the neurotypical brain. And recent research by Dr. Kirkesny, and I'm not sure I'm saying his name right, et al., 2024, a brain organoid study demonstrated that the autistic brain differences are physical. They grew mini brains from basically pluripotent stem cells, and they found that the organoids from the brains of autistic children grew to be around 40% larger compared to neurotypical children. And in addition, there was larger sizes and faster growth, and this was associated with more severe types of autism. Overgrowth in the brain organoids also matched overgrowth in the social parts of the brain and indicated more severe autism. Honorable U.S. Magistrate Gary R. Jones experienced the different autistic language as plagued by incomprehensible and truly puzzling statements, various irrelevancies, and myriad word puzzles. He was unable and unwilling to interpret them. The Florida Attorney General called his experience of autistic speech a prolix stream of consciousness, convoluted narrative that he can't discern what the autistic language is saying. Assistant United States Attorney Peter G. Fisher, no physical, mental, or linguistic barrier. And that an autistic person who's diagnosed, does not have a physical, mental, or linguistic limitation. Karen K. Spacey, that autism affects a person's ability to communicate and interact with others. It caused the Honorable Karen K. Spacey to hand out a transcript of autistic language with 24 inaudibles in it. And then, because no language interpreter was provided, the Honorable Karen K. Spacey had to cancel a hearing because it was problematic, because there was a lack of court reporters willing, or I suppose able, to record the proceedings in a case involving an autistic person with different autistic language. And all the while, according to Honorable Magistrate Gary R. Jones, but the same language, I believe, was used by Karen K. Spacey, the Honorable Karen K. Spacey, I suffers from autism spectrum disabilities and does not consider the diagnosis problem in elderly people, and saying that my husband, David Petrano, did not. When autistic language is different, it leads lawyers such as Trevor Rhodes and Carl Schweit to interpret that I am a member of the bar. Here you have plaintiffs, plural, includes bar licensing. And this one's a little hard to see, but that misinterpretation of autistic language resulted in the U.S. Magistrate Honorable Gary R. Jones making a ruling in his order that I am a member of the State Bar of California. Those are a lot of misinterpretations. of the different autistic language that's different than neurotypicals. And they're very harmful because I never held myself out as being an attorney anywhere. It was Trevor Rhodes and Carl Schwait who held me out as being a licensed attorney, and the U.S. magistrate fell for it, hook, line, and sinker, and put it in an official order. Now, how harmful is that to have misinterpretations like that? But I'm not the only one. YouTube videos done by actually autistic people talk about being autistic traits being interpreted by neurotypicals as being rude and being misunderstood. So I'm not the only one. It doesn't just happen in courts and agencies with officials. It happens in society. So, in other words, if a bar examiner asks for references or does background checks, autistic people are being misunderstood by the persons they're asking about them because of the different autistic language that's physically and neurologically based and shown by gene expression difference. And so you can see this problem extends everywhere. Contracts. What did each side mean? So if there's statutes that require agreements or some bad thing happens, that's involving an autistic, neurotypical, different language interface. Miranda warnings, notices, court notices, guilty pleas, confessions, what else? Just anything involving a court. Anything involving a court. There are these language differences, misinterpretations. You're being misunderstood. And as Ryan Kelly says, and I love his videos, I follow his videos too, bad things happen. If we look at the Title II American with Disabilities Act guidelines for the Florida state court system, right here, where do they talk about the autistic different language as compared to neurotypical language used in the courts being different languages? Or an autistic language interpreter-translator for people with autism. Autistic people. See, they're not even using identity first language. This is based on outdated 1984 pamphlet by the late Deborah Norley, Florida bar member. I mean, the Florida state court system can't do any better than that to use outdated 1984 information about autistic people when it's 2024. And if we look at the Federal Courts Communication Disability Act, it says each federal court is required to provide at judiciary expense sign language interpreters or other appropriate auxiliary aids and services to participants in federal court proceedings who are deaf, hearing impaired, or have other communication disability. Hey, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to know that autistic people have communication disabilities. That's me. I have an other communication disability. I'm autistic. Where in any single one of my federal court cases did those federal courts ever comply with that Communication Disability Act of their own and provide me with an autistic language interpreter and translator? They didn't. They never have. This problem is compounded because in agency and court proceedings, they're not even accounting for the fact that more than 9 in 10 autistic people over the age of 50 don't have an autism diagnosis, yet they're autistic. More than 80% of women who are autistic are undiagnosed by the age of 18. So this is not a small problem. Autistic people have even written letters to prosecutors about what you should know about the autistic defendants you prosecute. Autism awareness includes recognizing the importance of autistic language interpreters and translators. In addition, I can't find it right now, but I had a page from the Oregon Federal Defender about their autistic clients that said that they recommend and provide autistic language interpreters. There is a recognition that there's an autism problem. Why do they need it? Why do they need it? Well, there's a Florida Bar article here about court interpreting and linguistic presence and absence in a case, where they say linguistic presence. That means that there's a number of courts that have ruled that an autistic person, being a party here, that physical presence in a courtroom is not enough to constitute legal presence. That the litigant has a right to meaningfully present everything that is being said in the case must be communicated in a language he or she can understand. This is called linguistic presence. It requires the services of a qualified language interpreter or translator. I think anyone can get the idea. I have repeatedly asked for an autistic language interpreter translator in all of my cases, and I have been repeatedly refused. Now, we live in the age of artificial intelligence. How hard would it be for the state and federal courts to pay AI creators if they can translate German to Spanish and Spanish to French and French to English? How hard would it be to ask them to make a program, an AI program, to translate between neurotypical people's language and autistic people's language? It wouldn't be very hard. And once the program was made, it would cost just pennies on the dollar for them to do it. But they won't do it. They refuse. They willfully refuse. And they continue to use neurotypical language and neurotypical standards to judge autistic people. Just like autistic people are judged in society as rude, as misunderstood. And we have to watch out for this AI, because my experience in my own cases has been some of the neurotypical programmed AI has tried to change the wording of due process to say that if they give you a myriad of chances, if they give you ample opportunity, you get due process, and they don't have to give you a language interpreter. Well, the United States Supreme Court in Matthews v. Eldridge said, due process is the opportunity to be heard at a meaningful time and in a meaningful manner. When I pointed it out to some courts that were using the AI substituted words, myriad of opportunities and ample opportunity, I was resoundingly shot down. I've done this video on a deep dive into the more than 43 different ways in which autistic language is a different language than neurotypical language. Now, the reason that this is a problem is because anytime an autistic person goes to a spoken hearing or trial, or files a written pleading or motion or document, the judge, the other lawyers, opposing lawyers, and the law clerks are interacting with the autistic person. And they are experiencing the autistic person's communication as a problem because it is atypical. When neurotypical lawyers and judges constantly blame autistic people for the communication problem, it is a two-way problem. There is no such thing as an autistic person who is free of language and communication differences. Even autistic people who are labeled fluently verbal are not free of language and communication differences. Now, this is a summary of many, many studies that are on the internet. That if you start querying in about differences in autistic language and autistic language problems, you'll come up with these. So the courts, the Florida courts, the federal courts, could have paid someone to research this, but they haven't. So difference number one. Autistic language follows a different atypical path and mode of learning trajectory. Perceptual and sensory signs in autistic people begin to diverge from neurotypical development at 9 months of age, and social signs begin to diverge at 12 months of age. So, atypical autistic socio-communicative behaviors and interests are observed before the emergence of formal language. Before atypical development is typically noticed by their parents. Autistic language and autistic special abilities are self-taught and can develop without social reinforcement. Learning in autistic people is mainly implicit and favors delayed echolalia of sentences and involves visual modalities. In autistic people, linguistic tasks deviate toward domain-specific visual expertise. Phonological and morphosyntactic problems are observed in nearly 1/3 of autistic people. Autistic people rely less than neurotypical people on prosodic cues to disambiguate sentences, and less on semantic plausibility to understand passives. Autistic people integrate semantic information differently when interpreting syntactic constructions. And semantic knowledge consolidates in a dissimilar manner. They choose less prototypical words or are less primed by semantic related words. Word learning depends more on enhanced associative learning in some autistic people. And so in some autistics, declarative memory may play a more central role in language acquisition. There are problems with syntax suggestive of an impairment in procedural memory in autistic people, and impairments in implicit learning. Autistic people have problems with binding relative clauses, WH questions, raising, and passives. Now, these are all in the language learning difference number one. Now, courts are using demeanor evidence. And that is facial expressions, body language, gestures, where your body is in space, the clothes you wear, all those kinds of things to determine credibility or whether the autistic person is being truthful. And that's a huge problem. That has discriminated against me in every single case I've ever been in that's had any kind of a spoken hearing or trial. This is autistic language difference number two. Autistic litigants often cannot communicate nonverbal language, like through hand gestures, eye contact, and facial expressions. Autistic people may display unusual, complicated movements of their hand or whole body, such as tensing their muscles, bouncing, or flapping their arms and hands when they're excited, distressed, or seeking sensory input, i.e. stimming. Autistic people have stereotyped and repetitive motor mannerisms and use of language. Hand flapping, body rocking, toe walking, spinning objects, sniffing and running objects across their peripheral vision. Autistic people miss nonverbal cues of others and nuances in social situations. When the courts are using demeanor to determine truthfulness, credibility, this has happened to me. In my cases, it was irreparably biased and prejudicial toward me as an autistic person because it virtually guarantees an almost 100% misinterpretation. And even worse than that, the communication, this type of communication going on between the neurotypical judges and the neurotypical opposing lawyers, or even if they try to make the autistic person get their own lawyer who's a neurotypical. This communication is all going on ex parte of the autistic persons being able to understand it in their awareness. Autistic language difference number 3. Autistic language does not include communicative and social gesture components. And these language differences also apply in society. They apply when you go to a business. They apply when you go for a job. They apply anywhere. So there's different gesture types that have different functions. And impairments in nonverbal communication is actually now required for an autism diagnosis. So there are co-speech gestures that are social and communicative, and they help neurotypicals with listener comprehension. In the neurotypical language, neurotypical people glean novel information from gestures that are not present in speech. The gestures can also add content to verbal interactions. They add visual spatial information that may not be conveyed by speech. They add emphasis or signal uncertainty. They serve critical pragmatic functions that are often overlooked, such as linking context of the physical environment to the context of the speech, allowing neurotypical listeners to make inferences about a speaker's intended meaning. In order to efficiently communicate and establish social interaction with others from an early age in the neurotypical language, people must be able to interpret both verbal and nonverbal messages. Autistic people cannot do this. We have a language difference. Most of us cannot interpret nonverbal messages, and especially not without younger autistics having received explicit instruction in this. Co-verbal gestures are defined as arm and hand movements that synchronize with speech. So they supplement language content, regulate speech flow, maintain attention between the speaker and listener, shift conversational topic, facilitate the continuation of a topic, and emphasize a particular topic or content. Conversational gestures are intentional communicative acts which have direct verbal translations consisting of a word or phrase which can easily be misunderstood without speech by certain neurotypical cultures or social groups. In autistic language, gestures are less closely synchronized with speech. Autistic people have difficulty using neurotypical language integration of eye, gaze, and gestures. And there's a physical reason for this. Autistic people have a reduced sensitivity to biological motion that prevents their ability to process social cues like gestures. The neurotypical language communicative gesture component is missing in the autistic language. And because autistic people don't natively use neurotypical language, conversational turn-taking can have problems. Smooth back and forth conversations, reliance on multiple linguistic pragmatic skills, initiating and maintaining conversational interactions. Autistic people may pause longer, speak slower, and are less likely to adhere to a conversational topic established by another person. These differences become more pronounced in highly social contexts. Okay, autistic language difference number 4. Autistic people may have Parkinson's type movements by the age of 18, which neurotypical lawyers, judges, people in society, agency officials, even law enforcement may misinterpret while using neurotypical language. People making contracts, anything like that, any type of legal matter where there's a problem with autistic language and neurotypical language interface. Neurotypical people using neurotypical language may assign an inferred meaning to what is essentially an involuntary Parkinsonism type tremor or one of the atypical mini motor movement differences autistic people have. Autistic people may have repetitive movements, unusual gait, or poor coordination, or tics. There are actual findings that autistic people have a higher risk of Parkinson's disease as young as beginning at the age of 18. They may have difficulty initiating or switching movements or freezing movements. Neurotypical lawyers and judges, neurotypical people, agency officials, and neurotypical law enforcement officers may misinterpret these movements by assigning an inferred neurotypical languaging to what is essentially an involuntary tremor. Autistic language difference number 5. Autistic people and litigants cannot attend to an auditory message if they're stressed or having sensory overload. Autistic language difference number 5. Monotropism. Autistic people may have monotropism, which is a tendency to focus attention tightly. It may cause autistic people to miss things outside their attention tunnel because within it, their focused attention lends itself to intense experiences, deep thinking, and more specifically to flow states. This form of hyper-focus makes it harder for an autistic person to redirect their attention, including starting and stopping tasks. Because of monotropism, autistic people may have interests that are active at any given time and tend to consume most of the autistic person's available attention, causing difficulty with other tasks such as conventional social interaction. This monotropism characteristic is captured in the current DSM-5 as highly restricted fixated interests that are abnormal in intensity or focus. Monotropism is a distinct approach to attention. It's an integral aspect of autistic identity. The autistic language is different because neurotypical people possess a broader attention span, which allows their focus to be dispersed and encompass a wider range, the ability to multitask. It allows them to absorb disparate visual and other sensory information, simultaneously holding multiple interests in their mind, which is known as polytropism. Due to this abundance of information and occupying neurotypical language and polytropic attention, neurotypical people exhibit less concern for acquiring intricate details about a specific subject and are less emotionally invested in those interests when compared to autistic people using a monotropic autistic language. This difference in the autistic language and the neurotypical language can bring unwanted social attention or exclusion on autistic people because neurotypical people may grow irritated or even shame autistic people for their singular focus. This is not a personal failing or deficit, but a processing language difference. It's a distinct language cognitive style in autistic people characterized by a strong concentration on specific interests or activities. I may get these numbers out of order, but I believe this is autistic language difference number 6. Autistic people and autistic litigants cannot process dynamic information. The neurotypical majority has designed the neurotypical world for their own processing style, dynamic processing. And they navigate around their world every day by processing all this dynamic information simultaneously. Autistic language and neurotypical language are different because of the differences in brain wirings in how to process dynamic information in autistic people versus neurotypical people. Neurotypical people intuitively process all this dynamic information simultaneously. Autistic people have to process the information sequentially, piecing the information together to see the whole picture eventually. Autistic people literally must connect the dots to divine the plots that neurotypical people read intuitively. What neurotypical people process subconsciously, autistic people must consciously figure it out, piecing this together. And this is explained in great detail on Bill Nason's autism discussion page on Facebook. This is because the neurotypical brain has what's called strong central coherence of long-range modern human neurotypical brain connections. And so they can process all this dynamic information smoothly, intuitively, and subconsciously below their level of consciousness. And so the way the neurotypical people, especially in the court systems and lawyers and judges, explain it, it allows them to attend to the most relevant information. Autistic people, however, cannot simultaneously integrate all the dynamic information, but must sort sequentially, consciously piecing together the information. This is very taxing and mentally draining on the autistic person. It also causes autistic people to have delayed language processing. The sequential serial reasoning slows down the processing of information, often leaving the autistic person missing much of the rapidly changing dynamic information. Much of the information, words, actions, meanings, etc., is too fleeting to be processed sequentially. So the autistic person is often left with limited information that does not integrate very well. Not only is information lost in translation, but appraising information sequentially significantly slows down the processing for autistic people. This leaves autistic persons struggling to keep up with the speed of information. That is the speed of information and language being used in agency proceedings and courts by officials, administrative law judges, opposing lawyers, and any other type of court adjuncts. This also happens in society. Often the autistic person only processes pieces of the total amount of the information, much of it coming and going before it is ever processed. So when the autistic person is only acting on pieces of the information, their interpretation and resulting behavior is often out of sync with the rest of the neurotypical people. Consequently, socially, the autistic person is left confused and stumbling through daily interactions with neurotypical others in society, in agencies, and in the courts. And even if they have to hire a neurotypical lawyer. I know myself I cannot get effective representation from any neurotypical lawyer because of this. The autistic and neurotypical language difference is like two computers with different operating systems, and effective communication it doesn't happen. Without the ability to rapidly process dynamic information, autistic people often get lost in the flux of dynamic information in the neurotypical language. This autistic delay in processing can vary from 10 to 30 seconds or longer, sometimes several hours, depending on situational variables, how drained the autistic person's brain is already, and the complexity of the information. So, for example, I have been told I failed to preserve error for an appeal from a lower trial court because of this immutable characteristic of my autistic language. And this is something that is a physical impossibility. When given extra time, an autistic person can often process accurately, but will become confused and overwhelmed if neurotypical people press the autistic person to process faster. Research has shown that the average wait time for expecting a neurotypical person to respond to a question or request is a couple of seconds. And after a few seconds, neurotypical people start repeating the request and increase prompting. When neurotypical lawyers and judges and people in society expect a rapid response from an autistic person, someone with processing delays due to the difference in the autistic language and neurotypical language. The neurotypical person creates mass frustration. Each time the neurotypical person repeats the question or prompt before the autistic person has completed the processing, the autistic person must start the processing all over again. After neurotypical people restate the prompt several times, the autistic person becomes very frustrated, cannot process it fast enough, and become overwhelmed. And then the lawyers and judges and agency officials label the autistic person as defiant and oppositional due to the immutable traits of the autistic language. As mentioned before, many autistic people think in pictures, not words. And Bill Nason in the Autism Discussion Group describes this and what happens as a result of this. And this isn't because the autistic person is stupid or dumb or has an intellectual disability, but simply it's a language difference. And Bill Nason says that neurotypical people can change their neurotypical language communication to bridge these autistic language differences. He says when it appears to the neurotypical person that the autistic person is uninterested, oppositional, or indifferent, first, the neurotypical person needs to assume this may well be an autistic language processing issue before misinterpreting the autistic person's actions as rude or defiant. Because usually the autistic person either does not understand or misinterprets the autistic language the autistic person wants. The neurotypical person needs to try a different, more literal way. So in order to be fundamentally fair, and this is what I've experienced in my hearings and proceedings, a neurotypical judge needs to distinguish between two types of information: static information and dynamic information. Static information refers to information that is concrete, constant, and absolute, and includes facts and data, historical events, details that are constant, logical, and do not change. Concrete details, especially in what we see, hear, smell, taste, sensory detail. And autistic people's experience of static detail is very keen and unbiased. Procedural rules, such as 2 + 2 = 4, that are constant and absolute. Rules and procedures that are predictable, absolute, and do not change. Once the autistic person learns it, it stays the same. So these would not be the type of rules that judges typically use under an abuse of discretion standard. And I try to explain that to the courts in my cases. Also, static information includes perceptual patterns that are rhythmic, repetitive, and follow a predictable pattern, such as music or art. The processing of this static information is a strength for autistic people, stronger than static processing in neurotypical people. And this is why being autistic is not a deficit or a disorder, and it is an equally valuable human variation, because there are strong autistic abilities in art, sciences, data analysis, engineering, and computer science. Very important processing strengths for the advancement of society. Dynamic information is what's involved in most of neurotypical people's fast-paced social world. It's filled with dynamic, very fleeting, and continually changing information. The information is often very abstract, vague, and invisible, from which neurotypical people infer meaning. The dynamic information is not constant and absolute, but continually changing, varying between situations, continually assimilating and adjusting to new information. And because it's not static, rapid processing of this information requires ongoing appraising, evaluating, comparing, contrasting, and assimilating new information. And so in the neurotypical language, neurotypical people's knowledge of what they are experiencing and how they respond is continually changing and evolving based on new information that changes as situations unfold. Neither person in the communication may know where the conversation will lead from moment to moment as it evolves from the continuous free-floating exchange between the two parties. This is what happens at a hearing, in a trial, or even in a contract negotiation, or in people who are references or recommendations who are conversing. And as neurotypical people integrate and assimilate this dynamic information, they smoothly flow between topics, adjusting, modifying, and adapting as needed. Most neurotypical people's daily functioning consists of this, rapidly processing this dynamic information, inferring meaning from vague inferences, and often following invisible rules that vary on the context of the situation. A specific rule may apply in one situation, but must be modified in another situation. And autistic people have problems with following oral, verbal directions for this reason. If a judge does not write down the directions and put it into written form to convert the verbal dynamic information to static information, the autistic person is not going to be able to remember it or follow it. It's happened to me where an appeal court in the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals and in the district court refused to hear an issue I raised because of the immutable traits of my being autistic, that I could not follow instructions that were dynamic without having the judge write them down. So rapid processing of dynamic information simultaneously requires strong central coherence, long-range neurological connections for the information to be integrated, appraised, evaluated, and then assimilated into what is already being inferred. And this is the neurotypical brain. This is not the autistic brain. This is the neurotypical language, not the different autistic language. So neurotypical people's perception of what is occurring and expected is continually changing as they go along. And autistic people cannot do this. Autistic people cannot process this dynamic world in the way neurotypical people do and expect. The parts of life that are static, concrete, factual, absolute, and constant are very easy to process for autistic people. But the rest of the neurotypical design, dynamic social world, and neurotypical language, a vague, ever-changing, fast-evolving patterns leaves autistic people lost. Now, I believe this is probably autistic difference number 8. Neurotypical prosody language components are not in the autistic language. Autistic litigants may talk in a monotone voice, have a flat effect, and do not realize the need to control volume of their voice, speaking loudly, irrespective of where they are. Autistic people may use odd tones, irregular intonation, pitch, pace, rhythm, and articulation. Neurotypical people vary their pitch, loudness, tempo, and rhythm of speech in order to convey different meanings in the neurotypical language. Autistic people don't do this and cannot recognize neurotypical prosody language patterns to grasp what is being said in the neurotypical language, and this lack of a language interface that is mutually intelligible results in autistic people being misunderstood by neurotypical people. And so there's a criticism of the use of official transcripts in court proceedings because they discriminate against autistic litigants. I've been discriminated against this way because official transcripts of speech are stripped from prosodic information. And so in my own life, in my own cases, this has violated my due process rights. It does not allow the courts to evaluate this misinterpretation ongoing through a court proceeding between neurotypical language and different autistic language speakers and users. Crucially, impressions of atypical prosody in autistic people affects the perception neurotypical people have of autistic people, negatively impacting the quality of their social interactions and impeding the development of socio-communicative abilities. Also, using official transcripts detaches the original interaction context from the fixed transcript product. And so it doesn't allow an appeal court to evaluate a mismatch, for example, in the BDUs or basic discourse units of autistic language, and how the content and structure of the language is constructed incrementally in the ongoing discourse. This discriminates against autistic people and litigants, and has discriminated against me because I have been repeatedly denied access to the court of an appeal review because they try to force me to get an official transcript, which violates my due process rights in this way. Autistic language difference number 9. Autistic people and litigants exhibit linguistic disfluencies. The courts keep trying to force autistic people to be indistinguishable from a neurotypical, to mask, to use neurotypical language. But there are what neurotypical people consider to be difficulties in linguistic fluency related to working memory. That autistic people under stress may stutter and have non-stuttering disfluencies, as well as other atypical disfluencies like word final disfluencies that involve abrupt stops in speech that affect the latter part of a word, and non-stuttering disfluent discourse that often takes place when an autistic person forgets what he or she was going to say next. And it can involve exclamations and self-corrections, and it can really disrupt the neurotypical lawyers and judges' ability to understand what an autistic litigant is trying to say in their autistic language. Autistic language difference number 10. And I'm going to do a separate video on this about the vast damage the State Bar of California's Subcommittee on Moral Character did to me because they lacked autism educational training. And they failed to spot reversed pronouns. I'm doing a separate video on that because that in itself is a whole separate video. But autistic people using autistic language may reverse pronouns. So some autistic people may refer to themselves as plurals by reversing pronouns. For example, they may switch I to we and they. They may switch I to you. And oftentimes reversing these pronouns or slipping these pronouns may be misinterpreted often by police, forensics, bar examiners, civil and criminal justice system, lawyers, judges, and even people in society, and nobody has thought of these consequences. Autistic people are often known for being imprecise with their pronoun usage. For example, autistic people may talk fast, drop pronouns, swap pronouns when they're tired, stressed, overloaded, or talking too fast or in a meltdown. For example, they may say, him was telling me not to do that, or mixing up he and she when there's no gender ambiguity. They may also get he, him, she, her, they, them, they, we, them, we mixed up as a function of the autistic language and autistic grammar differences. The use of we instead of I or they or vice versa is a significant serious language use difference because it can be misinterpreted as the words are bringing an indication of something else. Autistic people are highly vulnerable, naive, easily taken advantage of, and often groomed. And these neurotypical lawyers and judges just ignore the differences in autistic language, like how could it possibly go wrong? The delayed language and grammar is pathologized or misinterpreted as something it isn't. Statement analysis with forensic problems within bar examiners or the criminal justice system. Pronouns are the key to deception in neurotypical people. And so when neurotypical judges and lawyers are taking these reading the body language and other classes like that, they are being taught to use these kinds of things as indicating deception, when all it is sometimes it's an autistic language difference of a pronoun reversal. The problems with language grammar and the use of pronouns in everyday basic language and social communication skills. That's when Social Security administrative law judges tell an autistic person, oh, you can work, and then deny a disability claim. Well, no, they're not considering this, that this is one of the reasons an autistic person cannot work in a neurotypical predominated work environment. Now, there's a lot of different autism research articles that try to figure out why are these pronoun reversals happening, or is there a pronoun confusion, or is it a social or linguistic mistake, or is it a theory of mind problem that autistic people can't take a different perspective than their own and put them in the shoes of someone else. In any event, whatever the cause is, autistic people reverse pronouns. And that is an autistic language difference from neurotypical language. Autistic language difference number 11. Autistic people's basic discourse units do not match with neurotypical people's. And so, again, which was already mentioned, that autistic people's autistic language linguistic profiles show consistent difficulties in pragmatics, including discourse skills and conversational abilities. And that's even in autistic people whose average syntactic, lexical, and phonological skills and IQ scores lie within typical ranges. Although autistic spoken and verbal discourse may superficially appear to be close to neurotypical people's, there are subtle but significant differences in the different language discourse. So if you do fine-grained analysis, neurotypical people using their neurotypical language often lead to their conclusion that the discourse of autistic people using autistic language is less coherent. And so there's a study by Gilhand et al. In 2020 where they performed a systematic analysis of linguistic features usually associated with three central dimensions of narrative discourse, narratives being widely studied in autistic people, a microstructure of syntactic complexity, a macrostructure of overall story structure and cohesive ties in internal state language, comparing autistic and neurotypical adults. Well, autistic adults did not lack the ability to create a story. They performed worse than their neurotypical peers on all three narrative dimensions. Autistic people using autistic language had more difficulty using and combining certain linguistic elements to construct and convey a coherent narrative discourse. This resulted in a higher frequency of features such as discourse markers and irrelevant, well, what neurotypical people consider to be irrelevant comments to the storyline. Autistic people displayed a lower frequency of linguistic features used by neurotypical speakers to develop story characters. For example, definite nominal expressions and pronominal expressions, internal state terms, and to establish a relationship between the story events, connectives. The resulting discourse composition is likely to make it harder for neurotypical listeners to piece together an enlightening and coherent narrative. This conclusion lines up with existing literature on narrative production in autistic people, including persistent difficulties in narrative abilities well into adulthood. So, Gielhand et al. Identified segments that speakers use to build a representation or interpretation of the discourse. A minimal discourse interpretation segment. And these are the segments neurotypical people use to piece together a coherent representation in a discourse situation. According to Degan and Simon in a prior study, neither the morphosyntactic structure nor the prosodic arrangement of spoken speech suffice on their own to efficiently segment discourse into units. Therefore, minimal discourse units have to be looked at. And so they broke these discourse units down into boundaries of syntactic units and prosodic units that are mapped onto each other to yield what they call basic discourse units, or BDUs. And so these BDUs can map onto each other in different ways and correspond to different discourse strategies of information and interaction management. And so there are congruent BDUs where a one-to-one mapping between a syntactic unit and a prosodic unit results in a congruent BDU. And then there are syntax-bound BDUs where there's a one-to-many mapping where one syntactic unit corresponds to several internal prosodic units. There are discourse markers and adjuncts and regulatory BDUs, which reflect a meta discursive strategy with a focus on the coherence and or information structure of the unfolding discourse. These meta BDUs involve abstract and other neurotypical language components that are not in the autistic language. So these regulatory meta BDUs can be used to reflect the neurotypical speaker's evaluation of the validity of the information expressed by the autistic person, whether or not the autistic person is giving a personal opinion, or an indication of the autistic person's mental processes. These BDUs also are used to determine how to adjust communication between different kinds of audiences, whether formal or informal. Taken together, specific linguistic elements in the discourse, as well as the delivery style of verbal autistic people, distinguishes it from that of their neurotypical peers. Differences in neurotypical and autistic averbal dependency clauses and additional syntactic categories of discourse structuring devices are a stable difference between the discourse of autistic and neurotypical people. Autistic people produce more macro units of information than neurotypical people. Neurotypical people produce more meta regulatory BDUs than autistic people. This results in syntactic segmentation and distribution pattern of the BDU types that show meaningful differences between neurotypical and autistic people. Neurotypical and autistic language differences in discourse, coherence, and management. Further, when coherence relations are marked by connectives that are left implicit, where the coherence link is conveyed through the juxtaposition of two clauses or sentences, implicit relations that require the autistic person to infer the relation between the discourse segments using information from the linguistic context or their world knowledge, the autistic person is not going to understand it. In other words, the BDU units in autistic people's autistic language and neurotypical people's neurotypical language do not match. And this means that autistic language and neurotypical language are different languages, and they are not mutually intelligible. And considering that BDUs serve as the minimal input for neurotypical inference-based language interpretation process and inference drawing, the discourse strategies reflected in the spoken discourse of autistic adults are likely to make it more difficult for neurotypical listeners to construct a coherent mental representation of the ongoing discourse. And these circumstances can virtually 100% guarantee neurotypical lawyers and judges are making a wrong conclusion, or anyone else in society that is communicating with an autistic person. Now, communications in agencies and courts are not only spoken in hearings and trials, they are also done through written pleadings, motions, responses, and other documents. And sometimes, lately with all this court budget cutting, autistic litigants don't even get hearings. Autistic language difference number 12. Autistic litigants can have fine motor impairments. That makes writing and typing difficult for an autistic person due to improper grip and the physical act of writing causing pain, and hunting and pecking at the keyboard. And often because of this, autistic people, like other kinds of mobility impaired disabled people, may try to use an incorporation paragraph, for example, in the count of a complaint, and incorporate other paragraphs in other parts of the complaint into that count as a disability accommodation for the mobility impairment. And when an autistic person does that, neurotypical judges and lawyers start with the shotgun pleadings and the punishments and dismiss the case just because the autistic person needs and might try to use an autistic fine motor impairment mobility disability accommodation. Autistic language difference number 13. Differences in autistic language and speech and writing patterns. There are a number of what neurotypicals call abnormal speech patterns in autistic litigants, but these are actually autistic language differences, including immediate and delayed echolalia, pronoun reversal, metaphorical language, poor grammatical structure, atonality, and idiosyncratic speech, including stereotypical or inappropriate words. This is a neurotypical label. What neurotypicals label as inappropriate words. So autistic people's version of language often includes formal words, unusual sentences, neologisms, or words and expressions they themselves have created. Well, it's not always that autistic people have individually created these words, but some of these words and expressions may actually be words and expressions in the autistic language itself. Autistic people's interpretation of other statements are experienced by neurotypical people as being too literal. And neurotypical people complain that autistic people may not understand metaphors, humor, or may find it difficult to tell stories. Autistic language difference number 14. Autistic litigants' word meanings of vocabulary are not as expansive as neurotypical people's. The depth of meaning for specific words used may be restricted, or the breadth of vocabulary may not be as expansive as autistic language utterances may suggest to a neurotypical person. This is just another way of saying autistic language is a different language than neurotypical language. And it works two ways. It isn't that the autistic people need to have their language fixed and that it's broken. So now we'll get to autistic language difference number 15. Autistic people have iconic representation differences in their autistic language. So, in learning language, before the development of dual representation, young neurotypical children often manually interact with pictorial symbols as though they were the objects they depict, such as licking a picture of an ice cream cone. But after the age of 30 months, neurotypical children understand the referential nature of pictures. Autistic children more often demonstrate associative responding, restricting the label to the pictorial symbol itself and failing to generalize to real-world objects. This predisposition toward associational responding may implicate a different route of symbol acquisition and processing that could affect autistic language development. Language is thought to scaffold symbol learning and neurotypical development. Moreover, young neurotypical children generalize an exemplar to other category members when the item is labeled and when they are given a verbal description of the item's function. Autistic people and neurotypical people differ. Neurotypical children more often demonstrate referential responding when the target was labeled compared to when it was not. That was not the case for autistic children, who exhibited no significant difference in referential responding between the labeled and unlabeled conditions. Unlike children in early neurotypical development, language does not scaffold symbolic understanding in autistic children. Highly iconic, that is, realistic images have been found to aid the referential understanding of autistic children and young neurotypical children. Although the influence of iconicity lessens with age and neurotypical development, autistic children often continue to rely on a high level of realism when matching a symbol to a real-world object. And this is not insignificant. Autistic language difference number 6. Delays or differences in categorizing or labeling. Neurotypical people have strong and fluent labeling skills. Well, that's from the neurotypical perspective, because they're the dominant majority, including characterizing and naming features and functions of items. And neurotypical people are better able to answer WH questions when they read. An autistic person who has learned only to say, spell, or label a thing will have difficulty answering WH questions about the thing and will show parts neurotypical people consider missing in their autistic comprehension skills. When an autistic litigant has delays or differences in their ability to label and categorize items, it impacts their ability to answer questions related to the text and to later build on those skills to compose text. This difference in categorizing and labeling goes back to the difference in the semantic clusters. It goes back to autistic children lining up their toys to learn to make their own categories from bottom-up language processing versus neurotypical language where they're top-down and they learn to see the big picture and adjust and infer all the details from there. They are very different. Neurotypicals use social categories. Autistic people use object categories. They are different. They are not mutually intelligible between the different languages. And so that brings us to, I believe, autistic language difference number 17. Autistic categorizing versus neurotypical categorizing. How autistic children spend a long time during childhood developing, lining up toys and other objects, and how that is the process of learning to categorize, that it is a bottom-up process based on their physical, sensory-based world. And autistic people store these categories in different semantic clusters to that of neurotypical people. Neurotypical people learn to categorize by social relationships. They store words rather than concepts they associate, or rather concepts they associate with words throughout both brain hemispheres and in clusters or semantic groups of different concepts in the brain. And these are based on social relationships. So these clusters of ideas are connected differently in the autistic language versus the neurotypical language. The neurotypical brain developed its globular form with long-range neural network connections that had been isolated semantic clusters of words. The long-range connections in the strong central coherence neurotypical brain links up unrelated semantic clusters of words, and this is how basically make stuff up. Make metaphors, link unrelated ideas and clusters. And this is something that's not in the autistic language. They remain isolated in the autistic brain, in the autistic language. So while neurotypical people and autistic people have equivalent capacity for iconic words, they appear to differ with respect to storing ideas in semantic clusters in the brain. By linking up different clusters in the brain that are responsible for storing groups of concepts, neurotypical people gain the capacity to think and use neurotypical version of language and communicate using metaphor. This allowed them to draw a line between widely different concepts and ideas. And it enables neurotypical people using neurotypical language to come up with complex and abstract concepts. Autistic people may use iconic and arbitrary words, but these are restricted to concrete entities, those that provide sensations. Semantics involves how language is organized and express meanings. Semantic differences in language affect abstract thinking, multiple meanings of words, and concept categorizations in the autistic language in understanding and speaking the neurotypical language. Difficulties with semantic aspect of language affect the autistic person's skills in abstract thinking, multiple meanings of words, concept categorization, and can mislead between using words in a spoken language and capability of fully understanding the language in context. What language? The neurotypical language. Again, this is the difference in the interface of autistic language versus neurotypical language. Autistic language difference number 18. Autistic language and information processing is a bottom-up, not top-down process. Bottom-up language is inductive. Data and details first, sort later. Ideas have empirical grounding. The autistic person collects the information and detail they believe to be related, then later sorts it into a meaningful big picture. It's an inductive reasoning thought process. Bottom-up language users have an associative thought process. Autistic people's autistic language approach is opposite of neurotypical people's. Autistic people use bottom-up language thinking and use details to build categories. This is based on the physical structure and wiring of the autistic brain due to a bombardment of sensory cues in taking in the details before the concept. There are EEG studies that prove autistic brains display bottom-up signaling greater than top-down channel flow. So this is a physical language processing difference. And therefore, it may take longer for an autistic person to filter out sensory details, but it does not miss important information that neurotypicals may miss using neurotypical language. But further, autistic bottom-up language processing is also autistic method of organizing. And I suppose this is probably all grouped into autistic language difference number 19. This is about the WH questions. Autistic litigants have difficulty with all WH question forms. Who, what, where, when, why, how, and others. Autistic people must be able to differentiate that who is referring to a person, where is referring to a place, when is referring to time, and what is referring to a noun. Autistic people may initially confuse what, who, when, and where questions and require additional supports to discriminate these questions from each other. For one thing, this is because why and how questions require abstract neurotypical language answers, a language autistic people don't speak. Answering why questions involves the autistic person being able to respond as a listener as well as to discriminate the meaning of why questions. Why and how questions have abstract answers. Abstractions are not within the fact-based literal language used by autistic people. Autistic language difference number 20. Delays or differences in abstract language and thinking. Pretend play as well as talking and thinking about things that are not present in the present tense are difficult tasks for autistic people who are literal and concrete in our thinking. When given comprehension questions and writing prompts that involve using imagination, these neurotypical writing tasks are extremely hard for autistic people to form a response to. Many autistic people are better able to write about literal facts and events that they have experienced before. Autistic language difference number 21. Autistic people use less developed grammatical structure. There's a misimpression that grammar is not affected in autistic people. But it is becoming recognized much more recently that grammar may also be different in a sizable proportion of autistic people. Grammatical morphology is particularly compromised, especially finiteness markings, and complex syntactical structures with passives, relative clauses, raising, and subject control structures. A difference that is syntactic in nature is that autistic people do not show a sensitivity to C command in establishing the complex syntactic dependency of binding, where the antecedent of a reflexive must C command it. A difference in the domain of complex syntactic dependencies supports research pointing to the presence of language impairments in the neurotypical version of language in a sizable proportion of autistic people. Both syntax and semantics are different in autistic litigants. Autistic people experience challenges across all neurotypical version of language subsystems, including pragmatics, grammar, semantic, syntax, phonology, and morphology. Autistic language difference number 22. Autistic people do not use the same level of recursive language as neurotypical people do. Autistic people understand basic sentence structure, but many have more difficulty with complex sentences that contain embedded and subordinate clauses, i.e. recursive language. But I think we are at autistic language difference number 23. Autistic people do not have social hierarchy in their autistic language. Autistic people have difficulty understanding the significance of another's role and need to adjust topic, the vocabulary, grammar, and tone of conversation accordingly to fit into the social hierarchy of the neurotypical language. Autistic language difference number 24. Autistic people use keyword language strategy instead of the message conveyed by the neurotypical grammar. Autistic people primarily attend to keywords rather than the message conveyed by the grammar. Autistic people may also have difficulty understanding the grammar and thus resort to keyword strategy when trying to communicate in the neurotypical version of language. Autistic language difference number 25. Autistic people have delays or differences in organizational skills. Autistic people may demonstrate what neurotypicals call problem behaviors over the number of words required in a sentence, the number of sentences required in a paragraph, and the number of paragraphs required to write a paper. This is a very significant autistic language difference because one of the things that happens in the federal courts is neurotypical opposing lawyers and federal neurotypical judges will invoke Rule 11 sanctions against an autistic person just solely because of our autistic language differences. And in the Florida state court system, the audacity of these almost 100% homogeneous neurotypical bar, they have created an intentional state court segregationist statute to try to censor autistic speech and viewpoint. They mislabel it a vexatious litigant statute. Now, in order historically to show that someone was a vexatious litigant, they would have had to bring a whole common law vexatious litigant lawsuit. You would have gotten discovery. The autistic person would have been able to say, I innocently was told by an autism organization I had to come in and sue, and I subjectively never was intending to harass or, use the wrong language in this court or anything like that. The autistic person would have been able to do that. But nowadays, to budget cut, and because of the comfort level and the intolerance of the neurotypical people in Florida's bar, what they did is they created this thing called a vexatious litigant statute, also known as, on its face, autistic segregation statute, that uses the autistic immutable traits of autistic version of language, the diagnostic criteria of autism, to name autistic people to that statute and to that registry. And one of the primary eligibility criteria for these Rule 11 sanctions and for this autistic, so-called neurotypically labeled vexatious autistic language segregationist statute is that autistic litigants have a different viewpoint and immutable autistic language traits on the number of words required in a sentence, the number of sentences required in a paragraph, and the number of paragraphs required to write a written pleading, motion, response, or paper. And that autistic people therefore produce often literal, lengthy, detailed written papers. And so it's a particular problem, but that brings us to autistic language difference number, I believe, 26. Autistic litigants use literal, detailed, lengthy, pedantic language. So the first published accounts of verbal autistic people included descriptions of overly formal and pedantic language, making them sound like little professors, and thinking and speaking patterns of autistic people described as literal soon followed. So autistic people's autistic language is more concrete and object-focused than neurotypical people's neurotypical language. Autistic language is more concrete and object-focused than neurotypical people's language. So autistic people in their autistic language use significantly more nouns than neurotypical people during narration tasks, and a concrete object-oriented narrative style that is a core linguistic marker of autism. Further, unlike neurotypical females, Autistic female people and litigants produce relatively high rates of concrete, object-oriented words during their narratives, suggesting greater than average attunement to objects. And autistic people, because they're likely to use words in their autistic language that are not considered by neurotypical people to be appropriate in particular contexts, may resort to pedantic speech. Pedantic speech can be expressed by informal prosody in speech or by verbal content in written speech that is strange, philosophical, and labeled by neurotypical people as pompous. The characteristics of this kind of speech are a hyper-information which neurotypical people do not consider as necessary or relevant, vocabulary and grammar used in written speech and not in oral speech, repetitions and corrections that neurotypical people do not consider necessary. Autistic language difference number 27. Autistic people monologue and have difficulty engaging in reciprocal conversation. Well, that's mostly social conversation, which is neurotypical language. Autistic people deliver monologues, lectures, or lessons about a favorite topic rather than allow or participate in reciprocal involvement with a social communication partner. Autistic litigants do not know strategies to initiate, terminate, or facilitate a conversation in the neurotypical language. Autistic people lack a repertoire or have difficulty selecting or applying what is considered by neurotypical people to be appropriate social communication strategies in everyday situations. Now, why is that? Well, it's pretty simple. Autistic people don't have a social component in their brain, for the most part. That's just the basic general idea. And autistic language does not have most of the social components of the language that neurotypical social language has. So now we get to autistic language difference number 28. Parts of neurotypical language is not in the autistic language, such as idioms, metaphors, similes, and irony. And so autistic people have difficulty with the figurative neurotypical language, such as idioms, metaphors, similes, and ironies, have difficulty recognizing in contextual, conversational, or text print situations that concern vocabulary words that may have alternative meanings. And autistic people do not naturally and natively engage in small talk in the autistic language. Autistic language difference number 29. Neurotypical social language is not a part of the autistic language as far as theory of mind component of neurotypical language. And so this is what neurotypicals call mind blindness, which is defined as the inability to attribute or recognize the cognitive or emotional states of others or predict their behavior, referred to as a theory of mind impairment. And so neurotypical people speaking neurotypical language always complain that autistic people have difficulty seeing another person's perspective and have a tendency to interpret from their own point of view. And it impacts social interaction with neurotypical people and neurotypical people's neurotypical language understanding of perspective in narratives. Autistic people have difficulty understanding that other neurotypical people have unique thoughts, ideas, and personal motivation. Autistic people experience difficulty in recognizing neurotypicals' lies, deception, and mischief. Autistic people do not have the ability to talk and write about a situation from the perspective of another neurotypical person's thoughts, feelings, or experience, and it's a very difficult task for autistic people to do so. This affects their reading comprehension, neurotypical's comprehension of what autistic people write, and creates a double empathy, mutual unintelligibility problem. And that's because there's a double empathy problem. And this problem goes two ways. Neurotypical people also have theory of mind impairments in understanding and interpreting the same in autistic people. And so impaired social communication is a core feature of the autism diagnosis. Autistic language difference number 30. Autistic people may make factually true statements that are socially awkward or socially offensive within the neurotypical language. And this is when neurotypical people start complaining that the autistic language that the autistic person said is socially inappropriate and lacks awareness of the impact of the autistic person's statements on others. But autistic lawyers and judges carry it to a much bigger extreme that's very harmful. If an autistic person like me files a Title II American with Disabilities Act lawsuit because of a failure to reasonably accommodate our autistic disabilities, such as the need for across-the-board extra time, then because the neurotypical lawyers and the neurotypical judges that are almost 100% homogenous in the legal system speak only the neurotypical version of language, which has social hierarchies, these neurotypical judges take it as a social offense by the autistic person against the neurotypical judge. And the neurotypical opposing lawyers take it as a social offense and socially inappropriate, even though Congress of the United States said in Title II of the American with Disabilities Act that a disabled, qualified individual with a disability, like me, can sue the court. And even though the Federal District Court in Orlando, Florida, and the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals on review of that decision specifically ruled that me as an autistic person can sue a judge in individual capacity for retaliation. Nevertheless, neurotypical people, lawyers and judges, consider it a social offense of the social neurotypical language hierarchy if I exercise my ADA rights, my Title II ADA rights, and sue them for a wrong or for money damages for an injury that they caused to me. And even though Congress has authorized me to sue under Title II of the ADA for those wrongs, and specifically name state courts as public entities who can be sued, nevertheless, Florida neurotypical judges will name an autistic litigant on the basis of the diagnostic criteria of an autism spectrum disorder as a vexatious litigant for simply suing the judge for a Title II Americans with Disabilities Act discrimination violation. So this language difference of the autistic language from the neurotypical language of making socially awkward or socially offensive statements within the neurotypical language, even though in the autistic language they are factually true, this is a significant problem in the language interface. Autistic language difference number 31. Autistic people have pragmatic language differences known as context blindness. In other words, the autistic language is different because of the way that autistic people and neurotypical people in their different languages understand context. So, for neurotypical people, the meaning of many stimuli is context dependent. This is because they do not experience raw sensory information and data the way autistic people do. The way autistic people take in raw sensory data in a bottom-up process directly. But instead, neurotypical people subconsciously filter it out before it reaches their consciousness. And so this makes autistic people context blind in the neurotypical language. Because autistic people give meaning in absolute raw sensory literal words rather than in a contextually sensitive neurotypical way. And so this is a problem for due process. Notice that I have gotten as an autistic person from Social Security Administration and from courts, because neurotypical people need to clarify for the autistic person like me the context by giving all the bottom-up detail in the notice so that autistic people like me can find our way blindly in a world full of relative meanings. Autistic people have pragmatic difficulties that interfere with the neurotypical language production and neurotypical language comprehension in a given context. They include features such as providing limited information to the conversational partner and attention to social cues during a conversation. Neurotypical people get their meaning from what something or someone looks like. Because of this, all neurotypical people see when they experience or interact with an autistic person is problem behavior. Neurotypical people never ask what the reasons are for the autistic so-called problem behavior. They judge the problem behavior on the basis of neurotypical expectations and neurotypical common sense. But the reasons for the autistic problem behavior is the different autistic literal language, OA contextual meanings. To understand autistic litigants' behavior and reactions, neurotypical people need to understand people's way of experiencing and understanding the world. This is described as autistic thinking because autistic people experience raw sensory information and the physical properties of objects. Autistic people do not have perception as it is defined in neurotypical thinking. Perception is defined as integrating all the pieces of information coming from the senses into a coherent whole or meaning. But this type of top-down neurotypical thinking is not in the autistic brain or the autistic language. It also has its flaws. The neurotypical top-down context-based thinking is in actuality a type of guessing grounded in prediction based on context and results in a certain amount of prediction error. The neurotypical brain predicts the integrated input package from their senses and process not the raw sensory stimulus data, but the prediction error. The prediction error is the difference between predicted and actual input. So neurotypical brains are using context subconsciously. The role of context sensitivity for neurotypical information processing is it helps them quickly find the right meaning of the stimuli, especially when the input is vague, incomplete, or ambiguous, by means of contextual priming. Example, rabbit duck. For neurotypical people, nothing has absolute meaning, but meanings depend on the context. In other words, because neurotypical people cannot experience raw sensory information, they cannot process absolute literal meaning that autistic people use in the autistic language. They have a different processor. So being neurotypical is sort of like having blurry vision. What they see is blurry to them, lacks clarity. They can't zero in on the meaning. So they have to have a context predictor mechanism, sort of like turning and adjusting a binocular lens, without which they would be lost and make high rates of errors in determining what it is they are seeing. So for neurotypical people, they live in a relative world blurred by their subconscious filter obscuring their vision. When they see something or someone, due to it being extremely blurry, it can have, for example, 3 possible meanings. And their context lens adjuster will help them sort out the best fit meaning from among their social concepts. That's their semantic clusters. Autistic people, on the other hand, have perfect clarity because autistic people experience and process the raw sensory information directly. So being autistic is like having 20/20 near perfect vision. And so autistic people don't need a context lens adjuster in order to reduce their error rate. Autistic people have a very low rate of errors. And so autistic people can get the one true, literal, absolute meaning straight from their raw sensory data they experience directly. Neurotypical people mischaracterize these autistic immutable traits as absolute thinking in a relative world, but actually it's a misconstrual of what is actually occurring. So from a neurotypical perspective, autistic people are context blind. Autistic people do not have spontaneous unconscious ability to use context when giving meaning to vague and ambiguous and abstract stimuli. So autistic people use a different literal language. They don't have the abstract social component in their brain or language. Second, autistic people see things in living organisms with clarity. They're seeing from raw sensory data, not blurry like neurotypical people. Neurotypical people have very few pixels in the extreme low resolution image they are seeing. Autistic people have a high definition resolution with many pixels. So what is often characterized as vague and ambiguous is the result of neurotypical people not giving sufficient details of information for an autistic person to understand it in the autistic language. In other words, neurotypical people pass on their few pixel low resolution image blur to others. Autistic people need all the details of many pixels and high resolution in order to understand in autistic language what the neurotypical is saying. And this is why the two different languages do not interface in an intelligible way. Vermeulen, 2012, characterized this different language interface as autistic meanings are stimulus-driven from raw sensory data and experienced directly, whereas neurotypical meanings are context-driven. Neurotypical people obtain the subconscious sensory integration context lens adjuster due to their globular brains from gene mutations during human evolution that autistic people don't have. Neurotypical people use their subconscious context lens adjuster to understand emotional expressions and recognition, and to understand social and emotional skills. Socially appropriate behavior equals contextually appropriate behavior. Now, autistic people could try to script all this stuff out, but because we don't have this globular brain subconscious context lens adjuster top-down brain, autistic people tend to lack social competence in neurotypical language and do not know when or where to use a scripted social or emotional skill set. Autistic people use scripts but process context variations as fixed rules. Neurotypical people use their subconscious context lens adjuster to understand language communication. So for neurotypical people, understanding language amounts to predicting language. They do this during sentence-level language comprehension. They use their context lens adjuster to make predictions about what the person is going to say or to show them, and this is called lexical priming. But autistic people use a different autistic language, and we are atypical and almost never meet neurotypical expectations. And due to the context lens adjuster for neurotypicals, the meaning of any of the following is never fixed, but varies depending on the context. Words, sentences, gestures, pictures, and other forms of visual communication, and even objects. Autistic people use fact-based literal language, so we don't do that. That's not in our autistic language. And our autistic literal language is considered an acontextual language. Autistic people, therefore, don't really understand what something means in this context. This is where the neurotypical and autistic different languages do not intelligibly interface. And neurotypical people maintain this attitude of superiority, that their contextual meaning is the right meaning. And what they need to be doing is using concrete communication to be making this what is invisible in their context-based neurotypical language visible to autistic people. In other words, they need to spell out the context in detail and what it means in a certain context. Autistic people, because we don't have the social component in our autistic language, if neurotypicals are thinking that autistic people are exhibiting inappropriate language behavior in social situations, autistic people are not going to be asking to clarify that or for comments or anything like that, because that's not a component in our language. And so this is a huge problem. And this is one of the reasons an autistic language interpreter-translator is required, is needed. Okay, I lost track of what number I'm on because a sudden Florida rainstorm just happened while I was filming this. But I believe I was on autistic language difference, maybe number 32. Autistic people use language in a way that assumes the neurotypical person they're communicating with knows everything the autistic person knows. Now, there's a couple reasons for this, but usually autistic people talking to autistic people know what the other, we know that each other know everything we know. So this is a difference in the language problem. And neurotypical people complain that autistic people have difficulty knowing that we have the responsibility to give communication partners sufficient information to understand the message. And, but we can't do that. We don't know that. We can't possibly guess what neurotypicals are going to come up with next in their neurotypical language. We just get side-blinded. So the neurotypical person needs to be bridging this communication gap. And in addition, autistic people have problems trying to figure out what information the neurotypical communication partner already has and what new information is needed. And this is because the neurotypical person almost never tells the autistic person this information. Autistic language difference number 33. Autistic people are said to have a prediction error language impairment. So, according to neurotypicals, impairment in prediction would render an observer unable to situate current observations about a person in the context of their antecedents or likely future states. And that autism is rooted in an impaired ability to predict events and other people's actions in this manner. And from the perspective of the autistic person, the world appears to be a magical rather than orderly place because neurotypical people's context predictor is so often in error, it makes events seem to occur randomly and unpredictably to the autistic person. And actually the thing is that autistic people can predict, but we don't predict the same way. Autistic people predict in a bottom-up manner. We predict by taking all the details and assembling them like a jigsaw puzzle. And from that, we can determine patterns and categories and look at the whole thing. And from that, we can make predictions. We just don't make predictions in the same way the neurotypical brain does. They make predictions in a totally alien manner from the way autistic people make predictions. But nevertheless, all of the research is neurotypical biased and neurotypical favoritism, and it's biased against autistic people, and usually it amounts to a litany of complaints by neurotypical people about autistic people, and this is just something autistic people have to live with, and it's just wrong, and it really needs to change, because in Canada, for example, I don't think that the English speakers could treat the French speakers this way and get away with it. They all have to get along. So, again, I'm trying to make this educational video and hope to pull this summary and pull all this research together because there's a problem in the two different languages in the language interface. So because of this lack of intelligibility between the neurotypical and autistic languages and the lack of a mutually intelligible interface, neurotypical people do very unpredictable things. It comes out of nowhere. And it doesn't seem like at all logical or predictable. So because of this, autistic people have repetitive behaviors and an insistence on a highly structured environment as a safety mechanism to help deal with neurotypical people's context-driven, unpredictable world. Autistic people need sameness in order to need a very predictable setting, because they sure aren't getting it from neurotypical people's neurotypical version of language. And so neurotypical language difference, I believe it is either number 34 or 35. This autistic safety mechanism arising from neurotypical people's high rate of context prediction errors causes autistic litigants to have repetitive language behaviors. So, autistic litigants, it is said, may be perseverative or bothersome on limited topics and may ask repetitive questions. And this is another one of the autistic diagnostic criteria that the state of Florida is using to put autistic litigants on its segregationist statute, and that federal courts use to sanction autistic people for their autistic communication. So context plays a role in these neurotypical language cognitive processes that are different than autistic language, including face perception, emotional recognition, social problem solving, speech perception and recognition, understanding neurotypical inference-based language, flexibility in behavior, and concept formation. The differences in communication, pragmatics, and social aspects of language are present in all autistic people, with this being the basis for the diagnostic of ASD. Autistic language difference, number 35. Autistic people have universally impaired narrative skills. And that is as observed neurotypical people. And so neurotypical people complain that autistic people have a lack of inclination or ability to construe and convey experiences through narrative. Well, this form of communication is actually not in the autistic language. And so neurotypical people complain that when autistic people are prompted, autistic people tend to produce stories lacking coherence. And narrative discourse or storytelling is a ubiquitous form of neurotypical communication used by neurotypicals to derive meaning from experiences and to construct shared understanding of events. And neurotypical people complain that autistic people have a host of narrative difficulties. And that autistic people display trouble enriching stories with psychological and social significance through the use of narrative evaluation, causal language, and explanations of protagonists' thoughts and feelings. And that because these pragmatic skills are universally impaired in autistic people, these difficulties include impoverished event explanations, reduced storage structure complexity, reduced coherence, reduced syntactic complexity, more ambiguous pronouns, fewer story grammar elements, poorer inferencing, and a tendency to include extraneous information. And some studies have found autistic people differ, including shorter stories and reduced causal statements. And that autistic people's narratives have been found to contain fewer cognitive process words, like think and know, also referenced to as mentalizing words or internal state language than narratives produced by neurotypical people. Reduced reliance on cognitive process words is due to the lack of a social cognition component in the autistic language. In other words, these are some of the language differences. We do not speak the same language. Autistic language and neurotypical language are not the same language. But for sure, neurotypical's complaints about autistic language always goes in one direction, blaming the autistic person. Autistic language difference number 36. Autistic people may have alexithymia. That is the inability to recognize and identify basic emotions of others and self. So autistic people can usually recognize and identify basic emotions such as mad, happy, sad, but have more difficulty with recognizing more subtle expressions of these feelings or emotions. Autistic people have difficulty recognizing, identifying, and understanding various other states of emotion expressed by other neurotypicals and knowing what to say in that situation. Autistic language difference number 37. Autistic people have so-called other prediction impairments. Autistic people have difficulty making predictions about the consequences of a situation and understanding the motivation of others, and will instead usually be very concrete and socially naive. This is, again, another aspect of this autistic brain doesn't have a social component, so-called theory of mind difference. And by failing to understand the emotions and motivations, this is really referring again to the lack of an intelligible language interface between the autistic language and the neurotypical language, because this goes in both directions. It's called the double empathy problem. Well, neurotypicals are saying that autistic people have no empathy and lack remorse. That is absolutely not true. That is one of their neurotypical lies, because neurotypical people have this so-called theory of mind, and therefore they're really good at lying and deceiving. And so therefore they use emotions and motivations to try to communicate in their social language. Well, autistic people don't do that. We don't have those social components in our language. We use a fact-based literal language. That's what we use. What you see is what you get. There is no reading in between the lines. Autistic language difference number 38. Autistic people cannot monitor incoming neurotypical communication and therefore don't seek clarification. Autistic people do not monitor their own comprehension of incoming messages and therefore do not seek clarification when needed. Well, autistic people don't speak the neurotypical language natively. This is not how our brain is wired. How many times do we have to say autistic people have a different brain? It's a different human variation. And so we don't process dynamic information like neurotypicals do in their neurotypical language. And I pointed that out in an earlier point. And so, of course, we're not going to be able to monitor comprehension of incoming messages in a language we don't speak, the neurotypical language. And so therefore, of course, we're not going to seek clarification. What do we seek? What have I asked for? How many times have I asked for it? An autistic language interpreter and translator. Why is it falling on deaf ears? Ask a neurotypical. Maybe you can get an answer. I have never been able to get an answer. Autistic language difference number 39. Autistic litigants do not use a neurotypical inference-based language. The neurotypical world is fast-paced with continual flux of rapidly changing dynamic information, flooding their neurotypical nervous systems from moment to moment. Neurotypical people are taking in multiple streams of information that must be filtered quickly and integrated smoothly together. The neurotypical nervous system has to filter out what is not important, understand the invisible context, integrate multiple information simultaneously, rapidly categorize and appraise the overall information, and decide what to do and then execute how to respond. Thus, neurotypical people have to multitask all these processes simultaneously, requiring the rapid processing of multiple information. And this comes from Bill Nason and the Autism Discussion page on Facebook. The brains of neurotypical people are physically due to long-range connections, more synchronized to process dynamic fluxes of information. And the neurotypical culture is patterned this way. They're the majority. So that's why it's patterned that way. So neurotypical people can rapidly process this multiple information simultaneously. Most of it subconsciously with minimal mental effort. Most of the processing they do intuitively without thinking about it or aware it's even occurring. Approximately 80% of the information neurotypical people intuitively process. Neurotypical people quickly scan the information for a few facts and immediately infer the overall meaning. Neurotypical people continually assimilate and accommodate new information and constantly readapt their responses to it. Neurotypical people smoothly process rapidly changing information while focusing their attention on the demands at hand. To rapidly process and integrate all this information, neurotypical people have to have good communication between the different brain centers. Hence, that is the strong central coherence, globular brain type with the long-range connections. At any given time, neurotypical people have information coming into different areas of the brain simultaneously. And all these different areas serve different functions and have to work together, simultaneously communicating with each other to integrate all this information. And this is what allows neurotypical people to rapidly process all the information with little effort, subconsciously, with minimum mental effort. And this is the neurotypical brain. They quickly scan the host of details for a few clues that allows them to grasp the overall picture. Neurotypical people immediately look for the underlying meaning between the details and then proceed to interpret the details by what meaning they assign. This is very dependent, of course, on how accurately they can infer the intended meaning from the minimal details. This physical central coherence brain allows neurotypical people to look past the concrete details and process the invisible relationships between the parts, to read between the lines. These parts of the neurotypical language are not in the autistic language. The autistic language is not an inference-based language. So socially, when relating to others, this neurotypical inferring helps neurotypical people to read the thoughts, feelings, perspectives, and intentions of others, theory of mind. This inferring allows them to share mental states and experiences with others and allows them to think about how others are thinking and predict how they will respond. It helps them to pattern what they say and how they act and allows them to stay connected both mentally and emotionally during the conversation. And all this description here of the neurotypical inference-based language is thanks to Bill Nason and the autism discussion page. Autistic language difference number 40. So neurotypical people's ability to stay connected both mentally and physically during the conversation actually depends on mirror neuron differences that autistic people don't have. And so mirror neurons, typical people's brains, discharge in response to observed actions of others. So when a neurotypical person observes another person performing an action that is part of their own motor repertoire, mirror neurons fire in their premotor cortex, revealing a type of observation execution matching system. And this activity is selected in the neurotypical brain for goal-directed behavior. That is not part of the autistic language. In other words, mirror neurons have the capacity to associate the visual representation of an observed motor action with the motor representation of the action in the neurotypical person, which leads the neurotypical person to actually feel and experience that action they're observing and can lead to imitative behaviors. So once another person's actions are represented and understood in terms of the neurotypical person's own actions, it's possible for the neurotypical person to predict the mental state of the observed person, leading to theory of mind abilities. Facial expression also activates the mirror neuron system in neurotypical people. Neurotypical empathy requires the ability to understand another person's internal mental state and implicates mirror neurons. Not only does neurotypical people's mirror neuron system fail to work on the atypical presentation of autistic people, however, but autistic litigants have impairments in imitation as well as theory of mind, and this leads to the inability to understand neurotypical's thoughts and behavior. So neurotypical brains and autistic brains are physically different. About one of the earlier points of difference being gestures and what happens when a neurotypical person is trying to interpret the meaning of an autistic motor atypicality or a Parkinsonism type tremor. So there's problems. There's difference in the autistic and the neurotypical language where they don't interface in an mutually intelligible manner. Autistic language difference number 41. And so there are physical differences in the autistic brain. So autistic people have weak central coherence, weak long-range connections between the various brain centers. So they cannot physically do this long-range, smooth connection to rapidly integrate dynamic information. It makes it difficult for the autistic brain to subconsciously process multiple information simultaneously. So instead, autistic people have to process the information sequentially, bit by bit, consciously sorting out the details like a jigsaw puzzle. They have to think their way through the information which neurotypical people process subconsciously with little mental energy. So research shows basically that autistic brains have weak central coherence, that connectivity differences occur from both underconnectivity in the long-range connections and overconnectivity, dense connections with limited synaptic pruning in the short-range connections within some brain centers. So either fewer neural pathways connect some areas of the brain or too many weak connections, scattering overwhelming information chaotically in other areas. At least that's the neurotypical take on it. Either way, there is major interference in the brain center's ability to communicate and integrate dynamic information. And this results in different styles of thinking. So where neurotypical people using neurotypical language tend to rapidly process, integrate, compare, contrast, categorize, and appraise dynamic information very smoothly and infer overall meaning intuitively and smoothly with little conscious thought, autistic people have to reach meaning by sequentially analyzing the numerous concrete detail. They have to piece together the puzzle one piece at a time. So neurotypical inference-based language is top-down and characterized as a linear thought process. It's characterized as so-called inefficient. It has to create the big picture first and then fill in the detail. And it's a deductive reasoning process and thought process. And it's just the opposite of autistic inductive thought process. Neurotypical people tend to assess concepts before the details. That's known as top-down thinking. They are taking in the concept before the details based on collective memories and not actual facts. Autistic litigants have difficulty grasping this so-called neurotypical top-down main idea, drawing conclusions and making other inferences from conversation, and may not be connecting idea to idea from conversation or text. Example, not connecting the content of one sentence to the next. Because autistic people do not use neurotypical inference-based language, autistic people may experience difficulties in planning and structuring their writing, as well as in physical act of writing itself. These challenges can impact their ability to effectively convey their thoughts and ideas on paper. Autistic people may have difficulty organizing their thoughts and ideas into a coherent neurotypical structure when writing. This can make their writing unclear and hard for neurotypical people to understand. Other challenges may include generating ideas, sequencing information, and maintaining a flow in their writing. The ability to talk and write about a situation from the perspective of another person's thoughts, feelings, or experiences is a very difficult task for autistic people. The different physical brain wiring for autistic people makes it difficult to look past the detail for the overall picture. It is more focused on reading the concrete details, facts. What you see and hear is what you get. They stay more true to the details and analyze the facts to piece together the overall picture. Hence, their thought processes can be less biased and truer to the facts. However, without the ability to make rapid inferences about hidden meanings, they often process what is said and did very literally. Since they do not immediately infer hidden meaning, they also are not looking at subtle cues, facial expressions, body language, voice fluctuations, etc., to infer what is meant when something is said. So consequently, neurotypical language communications move too fast and at a different level than autistic litigants' language communications. Neurotypical people are processing inferentially, and autistic people are processing factually. They are looking at the detail, and neurotypical people are looking at the global meaning. Although autistic people may eventually get to the meaning, neurotypical people infer by piecing together the detailed facts. It will be delayed in relation to the social processing neurotypical people are doing. Autistic people often have to think through the detail, while neurotypical people intuitively infer. So when communicating with autistic people, it's easier for neurotypical people to interact at autistic people's level of autistic language processing, factual, than to expect autistic people to relate at the neurotypical language inferential level that is not a part of the autistic language. Whereas neurotypical people can communicate more literally and factually, it is more difficult and sometimes impossible for autistic litigants to communicate inferentially. Autistic language difference, I believe it's number 41. And this gets to one of the most significant reasons autistic people and neurotypical people are speaking two different languages, notwithstanding how it looks to a neurotypical. Just like you don't look autistic. You can't say autistic language doesn't look autistic. So, difference number 41 is that autistic and neurotypical people are relating on two different planes, literal versus perspective taking. And again, this is thanks to Bill Nason in the Autism Discussion Group on Facebook, which is actually a very excellent resource for understanding autistic people. And so neurotypical people, when interacting, naturally look for intent and perspective of the other person to give meaning to their words. This is because neurotypical people have a social brain. Neurotypical people read between the words to understand the thoughts, feelings, and perspectives of others. Neurotypical people are looking at intent. Why are they saying what they are saying? Neurotypical people frequently read more into what is being said than the literal words. These traits of the neurotypical language guarantee an almost 100% certainty of misinterpretation of the autistic person. This is so because autistic people tend to speak very literally. What I say is what I mean, with little inferring or reading between the words needed. For autistic people, if their intent is not clear or obvious, and this is where neurotypical language runs amok, neurotypical people will project or infer intent to the autistic person. Of course, the intent or perspective they infer may not be the autistic person's true intent. This gets everyone into trouble because misunderstandings occur and feelings and people get hurt or angry. And in the courts, autistic people get sanctioned under Rule 11 for this. They get placed in a segregated court system in the Florida state courts, targeting the diagnostic criteria of autism as the eligibility criteria, the so-called vexatious litigant court ban. These are all facial laws in Florida, reactionary laws in Florida against its autistic population. It gets everyone into trouble. It's a natural tendency for neurotypical people to interpret intention rather than hear words literally. Just like it's the more immutable nature of autistic people to speak and listen to words literally. This is a language difference. These are two different languages. They do not have a mutually intelligible language interface. But again, people in society and officials and agencies in the courts, they don't get it. They don't get this because they haven't dug these research articles out. They haven't looked at these autism resources. They haven't bothered to do the hard work to take the deep dive. And so they don't get it. So much of the problem in socializing with neurotypical people for people who are autistic consists of neurotypical people speak with multiple meanings and intentions, often with hidden meaning, not literal to their words. Also, neurotypical people also infer the same as being done by the autistic person. So they immediately infer certain perspectives and intentions in the autistic person that are not there. And two, autistic people speak very literally, often meaning exactly what their words are saying. In turn, they often read the language of others very literally, so they usually do not understand the hidden meaning between the words, perspective, and intention of others. And so the bottom line is neurotypical and autistic people are speaking on different planes. Neurotypical people are speaking on a perspective-taking plane of interaction, and autistic people are speaking on a literal plane. It's a no-brainer. It's no wonder there is an almost 100% guarantee of a misunderstanding and a misinterpretation. It's caused by the clash in two different languages, autistic and neurotypical. Neurotypical people feel that the main disability is autistic people cannot understand where neurotypical people are coming from, lack of perspective taking. However, in turn, neurotypical people are also not understanding where autistic people are coming from. They read too much into the intent of autistic people. They read intent when that intent is not there. In a court, what this effectively turns into, what it's tantamount to, is neurotypical lawyers and judges fabricating facts that are not there about autistic people. Fabricating facts that are not there. It's a problem. There is a double empathy problem. Neurotypical people have just as much problems reading the thoughts, feelings, and perspectives of autistic people as autistic people have with neurotypical people. Neurotypical and autistic people are relating on different planes, both often missing the intent of the other. And when talking with autistic adults, Bill Nason on the autism discussion page on Facebook finds that this issue arises a lot, and it is central to autistic people living comfortably with others. So Bill Nason recommends autistic people should not assume that autistic people understand, and that neurotypical people should use a clarify and verify the meaning process when they're communicating with autistic people. So neurotypical people always try to not understand language literally. Try to read more into what the autistic person is saying. They try to understand the why behind the autistic person's words. They're trying to understand this from the so-called common sense experience of neurotypicals, of what is plausible to a neurotypical. So if the autistic person does not specify the why of what they're saying, neurotypical people will intuitively read the why, but will often be wrong. Neurotypical people are programmed to look for this, to see the hidden meaning. Neurotypical people are always trying to understand the perspectives and intentions of others. If they are not specifically clarified in the autistic person's answers, neurotypical people will guess at what meaning the autistic person's words have. And court decisions and outcomes of court cases are adjudged on this basis. They are adjudged every day on this basis. And what this basis amounts to is nothing more than sheer speculation. So neurotypical people are not usually interpreted literally. So they are not trying to read the autistic person's intentions to give meaning to the words. The the autistic person is taking the neurotypical person's words literally. So neurotypical language and autistic language do not interface and are not mutually intelligible. Almost all of the rules in all the courts are instructing the neurotypical judges because they are the neurotypical majority and they made the neurotypical designed rules. They're instructing the judges to read the intents and read between the lines. So the whole court system is skewed and biased and prejudiced against autistic people. It's actually instruct judges to do the 100% misinterpretation of autistic language. And it's a real problem. It's like, what do you do? Since a neurotypical person cannot understand what it's like to be autistic, and an autistic person cannot understand what it's like to be neurotypical, because we both have different brains. We both evolve differently. And so, really, the only other solution to this problem would be training an AI to do this interpretation and translation between the two different languages. But let's get to autistic language difference number 42. The neurotypical language is different from the autistic language because neurotypicals have autobiographical memory differences. So neurotypicals like to say that autistic people exhibit autobiographical memory differences to neurotypical people. Both episodic and semantic autobiographical memories are so-called impaired in autistic people who have difficulties in recalling events and facts from their personal life. And this is reflected, the lack of fluency on this is reflected in narrative tasks asking for personal episodic memories from autistic people and what they write. Reduced autobiographical memory specificity can interfere with social behaviors and social communication in the neurotypical language. This is due to the lack of a social brain component in the autistic brain. And so neurotypical people also say that autobiographical memory is closely linked to self-concept and fulfills directive and identity, social and adaptive functions. And the difference in autobiographical memory in autistic people may result in qualitatively different autobiographical narratives, notably regarding social identity. This ascribes to autistic people and their language impairments that interfere with developing and maintaining and understanding relationships. In autistic people displaying atypical behavioral adjustments to social contexts, as well as problems making friends and initiating a conversation or keeping one going, and impact autistic people's abilities to construct a social identity and define their personal identity relative to social groups. Well, in the neurotypical population, social identities are forged through validating and consensual social interactions. And autistic people don't have this kind of social brain. So neurotypical people feel that this lack of social brain hinders autistic people's sharing of experiences with members of different groups to which they belong, and to feel included as full group members in these groups. And so autobiographical memory includes long-term memory of general personal knowledge or facts, i.e. semantic autobiographical memory. We're back to the semantic clusters that are different, and specific events related to individuals' own lives, episodic autobiographical memory. And this episodic component allows neurotypical people to remember past experiences, episodic autobiographical memories, and to also imagine possible future experiences, episodic future thinking. Both episodic memories and future thinking involve autonoetic conscious, namely the ability to project states of self into time. And this allows, according to neurotypicals, people to retain a sense of being a coherent person throughout their lifetime and to update their self-identity while maintaining continuity. The directive function of autobiographical memory consists in using past experiences to guide present and future thoughts, actions, and behaviors and to solve problems. This is the common sense element that neurotypical people constantly use to judge the plausibility of anything an autistic person says, and to use their context filter. And the social function, it's also involved in theory of mind, the understanding of other people's internal worlds to predict their future behavior, and the social function of autobiographical memory, to make it easier for people to initiate, develop, maintain social interactions and relations through conversation. So by sharing personal experience and knowledge will facilitate understanding and empathy in social interactions and understand the emotions and feelings of others. Well, again, autistic people don't have a social brain. These are all differences in the neurotypical language and the neurotypical brain. And so this self-disclosure autobiographical memory process allows the development of close relationships with people who share memories, or provide the listener with information about oneself if someone was not present at the event. And autobiographical memory can be interpreted as an individual memory, but may extend to collective memory in a case of an event that people experienced together. And this is how neurotypicals create and maintain a social network and their social hierarchy. And so in the neurotypical language, neurotypical people find autistic people to be impaired in the episodic component of autobiographical memory. Reduced retrieval, specificity, elaboration, and episodic coherence, and a decrease in details, particularly narrative, perceptual, emotional, and cognitive ones. You know, it's like, how many times does an autistic person have to say, duh, autistic brains are different. We do not have a neurotypical social brain. And again, neurotypical people complain that autistic people fail to incorporate autobiographical details in their narratives to promote shared memories in a social context, and fail to grasp the value of using autobiographical memory as an object of social interaction, and that autistic people have insufficient appreciation of the basic neurotypical language communication rules, such as exchanges of autobiographical events. And autobiographical memory is consolidated through the act of storytelling in social relationships and regulated by communication rules. It is constructed from experiences of events, but is consolidated and reshaped through interactions with others. So autobiographical memory facilitates social engagement through shared memories and is enhanced by sharing narrative construction and exchanging memories with others. So this difference between the autistic and neurotypical languages leads neurotypical people to judge autistic people's narratives as disorganized and having irrelevant responses. So this also gets to another difference in the autistic and neurotypical languages, and that is about identity. And so neurotypical people feel in the neurotypical language that autistic people describe limited social interaction and provide less relevant information about themselves in relation to social experiences, and that this decrease in self-references may contribute to reduced mental capacity and social functioning and high autistic traits, and is associated with more severe autistic traits. Autistic people have limited vocabulary for describing internal states. Events neurotypical people experience are integrated and organized around internal information. They're adjusted according to neurotypical people's previous experiences and involve the working self. For neurotypical people, memory recollection with a feeling of reliving emerges from the coherence of the present self with the past self, making it possible to relive perceptual sensory details. So, as a result of this neurotypical autistic language difference, autistic people's lack of autobiographical social components in their autistic language makes it impossible for neurotypical people to relive their perceptual sensory details. And so this gets us to another problem with the difference between autistic language and neurotypical language, and that is autistic language difference, I believe, number 43. Is that in the neurotypical language, neurotypical people mislabel autistic people's identities by expecting autistic people to be indistinguishable from a neurotypical. And so neurotypical people, when they're trying to communicate with autistic people due to the difference in the autistic and neurotypical language, like to say that autistic people have an aberrant formation of a sense of identity. Well, that's because neurotypical people in their neurotypical language and their social brain understand that the self can be understood through groups with which individuals identify themselves. It's a social self approach that's based on having a social identity, that intra and intergroup behaviors vary according to how members of one group perceive themselves in relation to other groups. And self-categorization, how individuals perceive themselves and others in a group and the consequences of these perceptions. So the self for a neurotypical is modulated by interactions built in part by contrast with others, and others shape their identity. It's the key to their social interactions, maintaining social ties, and contributes to the sharing and co-construction of collective memory. So, neurotypical people and their neurotypical language are asking autistic people not to be ourselves or not to have an autistic identity. Autistic identity is different because autistic identity is based on values and not social interactions. So, autistic identity is based on a respect of an autistic person's passions and values. For an autistic person, honesty and authenticity is a central core part of most autistic people's identities. Living as anything other than an autistic person's authentic self is to be without an identity. Autistic people can never have an autistic identity if they forfeit their values to live in harmony with neurotypical people's social identities. Autistic people don't need to be normal, indistinguishable from a neurotypical. They need to be true. Autistic people need their autistic values and identity to remain safe. Neurotypical people using neurotypical language are likely to see this as a confrontation that is divisive because their identity is as a team member to the cohesion of a group. So even if a neurotypical agrees with an autistic person's values, they need their social identity to remain safe. And so this causes a bias and prejudice in the courts, in agencies, and in everyday interaction out in society between autistic language and neurotypical language and identity in the absence of an autistic language interpreter and translator. But the most important point of all, again, is that autistic people cannot change our fundamental identity and language processing method to be indistinguishable from a neurotypical. And this brings us to autistic language difference number 44, I believe. And this one is sort of important because neurotypicals are supposed to reasonably accommodate autistic people. And I've asked for these accommodations many times in Florida state and federal courts, and I just get ignored. And usually what happens in the Florida state court, and I'll paraphrase the Honorable Monica Brasington Circuit Judge, is I just take everything, your reasonable accommodation request, and I give it to the ADA coordinator, and she arranges them and provides them. Autistic difference number 44 is very important. One of the reasonable accommodations that neurotypical lawyers and judges need to use when interfacing neurotypical language with autistic language is needed to reduce autistic anxiety, and that is the use of imperative versus declarative language within the social interaction between the neurotypical person and the autistic person. It's not something a neurotypical judge gives to an ADA coordinator to provide. And so, as Bill Nason of the Autism Discussion Group on Facebook points out, that the greatest tool for reducing performance anxiety in autistic people is changing the way neurotypical people communicate with the autistic person. The language used, the questions, directives, instructions, prompts, and other questioning type of statements that are being used. And so these are meant when a neurotypical uses neurotypical language upon an autistic person in a court or anywhere else. They are used by the neurotypical person and meant to direct and control. This is imperative language, and it tends to put people on the spot, requires a specific answer, and causes social performance anxiety in autistic people who had difficulty interacting. Direct communication to act requires an autistic person to rapidly process dynamic information of what is being said and meant and how to respond and execute this response. And because autistic people cannot process this dynamic information this way due to the different autistic brain and different autistic language, it creates strong performance anxiety in autistic people. And it can cause sensory overload. And it can further inhibit autistic people's compromised communication differences in the face of the use of neurotypical language. On the other hand, declarative language is any statements not meant to produce a specific response, not prompting, directing, or instructing. It includes sharing thoughts, feelings, and ideas about something, describing events, sharing experiences and knowledge, and other interactions that are non-demanding. Such language is non-directive and does not produce performance anxiety in autistic people. And so autistic people, especially in the courts, feel freer to relate with neurotypical people when they are not questioning, prompting, and directing them to. And studies have found that when two neurotypical people are relating, their interactions tend to be 80% declarative language and 20% imperative language. They spend more time sharing thoughts, feelings, perspectives than questioning, prompting, and directing. But on the other hand, when neurotypical people and autistic people are relating, it tends to be the opposite, with neurotypical people using about 80% imperative and 20% declarative language if the conversational partner is autistic. Since the autistic person tends to struggle with communicating in the different neurotypical language, the neurotypical person will try to maintain, dominate, and control the interaction by asking more questions to draw a response from the autistic person. Unfortunately, the very neurotypical language that the neurotypical people are using on the autistic person to interact is not only biased, but increases performance anxiety in the autistic person. Instead of making it easier to relate and communicate, neurotypical people are making it harder. So neurotypical lawyers and judges need to be rephrasing what they say as a reasonable accommodation to autistic litigants to share thoughts, feelings, perspectives rather than prompting and directing. And I have encountered this personally in my cases, and it falls on deaf ears, and they take it as a social affront. And then they start, well, as Orion says, everything turns bad for the autistic person. Autistic language difference number 45. Autistic people have spiky profiles. They are not generalists like neurotypical people. And so this means basically neurotypical people cannot use their neurotypical version of language to take a one snapshot in time of an autistic person doing something and say the autistic person can do everything and they're just not trying, and if they can do this, they can do that. It's not like that. Autistic people have a spiky profile. It means there's a big difference in their level of ability from one task to another. They might be really great at doing one thing, but struggle at something else. And neurotypical people in their neurotypical language tend to assume if an autistic person is good at one thing, they will be equally as good at another. And so try to find reasons why the autistic person is not achieving as well in these other areas. And it will usually turn out to be something with their neurotypical inference-based language of inferring motivations and intentions that are not there. They must be lazy. They're not putting in enough effort. And so equally, if an autistic person is seen as struggling with something, it can then be assumed by the neurotypical language user that they need help with everything. So having a spiky profile means the autistic person is proficient and often very capable in certain areas and possibly deficient or incapable in others. And this can be very confusing to neurotypical people using neurotypical language with limited experience of autistic conditions and the autistic brain and the very different autistic language. Finally, autistic language difference, number 46. Autistic people have cognitive load limitations as compared to neurotypical people. And this impacts neurotypical language versus autistic language. Autistic people are more susceptible to cognitive load limitations because they have a weak central coherence brain wiring, and because autistic people's working memories are weaker than neurotypical people's. This is just back to the difference in the autistic brain from the neurotypical brain. Autistic people have more sensory data coming in, raw sensory data, which they cannot filter quickly enough. And that's because autistic people do not have this subconscious context filter that neurotypical people have. And so cognitive load refers to the amount of cognitive resources needed to perform a given task. The more complex the task, the more moving parts a problem has, the more demands of working memory, the higher the cognitive load. As the cognitive load increases, the person reaches a point where they cannot work effectively, and in autistic people, it causes a sensory overload, shutdown, or meltdown. So anything that is socially taxing for an autistic person will leave the autistic person with less cognitive resources and can lead to a sensory overload, shutdown, or meltdown. And cognitive load limitations in autistic people refer to input that far exceeds the autistic brain's information and language processing capacity. Given that autistic brains are different than neurotypical brains, an autistic person can reach their cognitive load limitation easier and faster than a neurotypical person. At that point, it's beyond the point of no return, and the autistic person's brain overloads, shutdowns, meltdowns, and the autistic person needs time to recover. Why is this important? It's important because autistic language for an autistic person does not pose a cognitive load limitation on the autistic person. But forcing an autistic person to become indistinguishable from a neurotypical by forcing the autistic person to use the neurotypical language imposes an enormous cognitive load upon the autistic person's cognitive load limited, different autistic brain. All of these, approximately 45 differences between autistic language and neurotypical language are extremely important, significant, and outcome determinative in virtually every communication in society between an autistic person and a neurotypical person, in state and federal agencies, in our state and federal courts, with law enforcement, with bar examiners, and virtually anywhere an autistic and neurotypical person try to communicate with each other in a mutually intelligible manner. Now, I'm actually autistic. And so you're getting this as autistic from the inside. You're not getting this from a neurotypical Esquire lawyer from the outside looking in. And if you do a review of neurotypical lawyers who have written about autism in the courts, you're not going to find anything in their guidelines, their videos, their educational materials that talk about being autistic from the inside and this almost total incomplete autistic versus neurotypical language incompatibility. Because failing to give an autistic language interpreter-translator to an autistic person in an almost 100% neurotypical bar and bench in the courts, when hiring a lawyer, when being forced to hire a lawyer, when communicating at any level of the courts, or any information being relied on, provided by third parties about the autistic person, it's going to go wrong. It's going to be an almost 100% misinterpretation and misunderstanding. And I'm speaking this from my firsthand personal experience as an autistic person. I'm not speaking this as to any other autistic person's specific case or specific set of facts or their specific life. I am relating my actual autistic experience, having graduated from law school, having passed the California bar examination, and having tried to get a fundamentally fair and impartial hearing and appeal in multiple courts at multiple levels and never getting my day in court. Have the AI programmed to interpret and translate between autistic and neurotypical people. Why is that so hard? And what is so wrong with that? Instead of having neurotypical lawyers and judges and neurotypical people in society inflict massive harm on autistic people. And if you like my videos, please hit the subscribe button and you will be notified of future videos. And thank you for watching.